another video recorded here in my van. I know this is becoming a more and more common occurrence, but this is where I've got peace and quiet and time, and I figure I may as well at least make the best of it and record something. So here we are. So today's video, a couple of folks have asked me to talk a little bit more about the vibrational state. I did make a video probably about a year ago on the vibrations, but this one's going to be a little bit different in that it's going to be geared more towards what you actually do to reach the vibrational state. Before we actually talk about this, though, I would like to preface this with a couple of things because everybody experiences things a little bit differently. So I've gotten a couple of emails recently from folks who say something like, I've projected before, it tends to be a spontaneous experience. I'm trying to figure out how to make this a more controlled, more consistent practice. And the catch is that I don't ever experience the vibrations. And so they're asking for advice. They say, how do I separate? When do I separate? How do I know where I'm at in the process without those vibrations to look for? And quite honestly, I don't have any great advice for these folks because for me, the process is always the same. It's always relaxation, vibrations, separation. And, the intensity of the vibrations may vary a little bit. The length of time that they last might vary, but they're always there. That's a consistent factor in my projection practice. So what I would like to ask is a huge favor for anybody who can project consistently, who's figured out some defined methodology of getting from awake to a projection experience, and you don't experience the vibrations. If you would be willing to start a conversation in the Facebook group, or at the very least in the comment thread below, and just give some advice on what people can look for. How do they know where they're at when they don't have that signpost in the road that says, here you are, vibrations ready to separate? If you could give some advice, I'm sure it would be greatly appreciated by a lot of people. Now, the second group of people I'd like to talk about is actually probably a much bigger group, at least based on the people that I get questions from. And these are people who they email and they say, I've reached the vibrational state. Now what do I do? I can't seem to separate. And quite honestly, I think these people fall into one of two categories. The first category is maybe you just experience things differently than I do, which is absolutely possible. We've just confirmed that there are people who project without the vibrations at all. But for me, again, it's really hard for me to give these folks advice because for me, the vibrational state is when I separate. And it can be at the beginning of the vibrational state when things are very rough, very jagged, very uncomfortable and intense feeling. Or it can be at the end when things have smoothed out and gained in intensity or gained in frequency and just turned more into like this warm, gentle, comfortable humming sensation, almost like a cell phone vibration pulsing through me. But regardless of if I'm doing it at the beginning or the end, I still roll out of body in the same manner. I roll out as though I'm rolling out of bed. The catch is if I roll out early when things are very intense, then the experience I've found starts out as a very dark, very sluggish, very low energy, almost drunk feeling sensation where I'm stumbling around in my room. If I wait until things smooth out a little bit, then the experience will be much brighter, much more lucid from the very beginning. But regardless, I'm out of body and there was nothing special I had to do between vibrations and separation. No intermediary step. So again, I'd like to ask a favor for those of you who get to the vibrations and there is something else required that you've been able to discover that has to happen between vibrations and separation. If you, again, would be able to post in the comments, talk in the Facebook group to some folks, and just define what that is. What is it that is that intermediary step between vibrations and separation? That would be a huge help for even more people than that first group. Now, talking about people who feel the vibrations but can't separate, as I said, I think these people fall into one of two categories. And the second category is, I'm convinced, is people who actually haven't reached the vibrational state, but they just think that they're there. And I hate to say that because I don't want to discourage people, and I know how much time and effort people put into this practice because I'm one of them. But the reason I believe this to be the case is because I email and I ask, I say, so describe what it is you're feeling, describe the sensations, and they'll say something like, I feel sort of a sensation of movement, or I feel the sense of vertigo in my head or my limbs, or I feel a tingling. And while these are all really great sensations, it means that you're on the way. It means that you're making progress. They aren't actually the vibrational state. And you can't separate during that process, during those sensations. Use those as a signpost in the road to know that you're on the right track, that you're making progress, but that isn't actually the vibrational state. So here I'd like to echo what William Buhlman says. He says in one of his books, I believe it's Adventures Beyond the Body, if you have any doubt in your mind as to whether or not you've reached the vibrational state, then you haven't. Robert Monroe says something very similar. He says, it's a difficult thing to describe, but you'll know when you get there. And I can echo that completely. This is the most insanely bizarre, intense sensation that you've experienced nothing like this in your physical waking life. Possibly unless you've been electrocuted, because it's a very electrocution type sensation. But when you get there, you will absolutely know. Robert Monroe describes it as a feeling of pulling a ring of fiery sparks down into his head. I've described it as being jabbed in the lower back with an electric cattle prod and 10,000 volts of electricity shooting up my spine. It is it's unmistakable. You won't say, I wonder if I'm there. It'll be one of these things where you just say, oh, that's what people are talking about. So anyways, I wanted to get that out of the way because I know everybody experiences these things differently. So I sort of wanted to just preface all of this conversation with that. But with that said, let's talk about how to reach the vibrational state. And so here, there is good news and there's bad news. So the bad news is there's not just, 3 easy steps, 1, 2, 3, and you're there. At least for me, it's a little more complicated than that. It's a little more involved. But the good news is that there are actually several ways to reach the vibrational state, at least that I've experienced personally, and I'm sure there's more on top of this that I haven't experienced. And the reason I say that's good news is that if you're watching this video and you have tried over and over again and you're using the same technique repeatedly and it's just not doing anything for you, then hopefully you'll be able to watch this and you'll be able to say, there's something I haven't tried, and it'll spark some idea that'll help push your practice forward. So that's the goal, and hopefully I'll do this topic justice. We will see. All right, so first, when we're talking about achieving the vibrational state, it really depends on the technique that you're attempting to use. So let's start by talking about the direct method. And for those of you new to this or not familiar with the terminology that I use, the direct method means that you are attempting to project without any lapse in consciousness. You lay down, you relax, you put your body to sleep, and you attempt to project. And I've got much more detailed videos out there in case you're interested in that entire process. I think I go on and on about that for probably close to an hour if you spread out across a couple of videos. So if you're interested in the direct method, take a look at the playlist. I think it's called How to Astral Project, and I've got a couple videos in there on it. So because I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the process here. But with the direct method, essentially there are 3 different ways that I achieve the vibrational state. First is my absolute least favorite, but it's worth mentioning because it was the very first way that I ever achieved any sort of success. And the reason it's the first method that I achieved success with is it's because it's what everybody tells you to do. Just practically every video out there on YouTube, at least half the books out there, they tell you to lay there, hold still, and wait for something to happen, which is exactly what I used to do. Absolutely what I would do at the beginning, and I would just lay there for hours and hours and hours and wait for things to happen. And occasionally things would happen. The thing that I don't like about this, as you can probably tell, is that it just takes an incredibly large amount of time. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, and you have to just remain absolutely still through this whole process. And that includes things like trying not to move your eyes, pick some spot that you can stare at just indefinitely. You got to pick some repetitive, monotonous thought to keep your mind busy and awake, but not too interested, whether it's your heartbeat or focusing on your breathing or whether that's counting or a mantra. And it just takes so long that this is a difficult thing to just maintain for that period of time. So for me personally, if this is the approach I'm using, I can usually get my body to start falling asleep and start feeling that wave of sleep paralysis between 45 minutes and an hour into the process. And this is just allowing the process to start. At this point, my body has decided my mind has gone to sleep because I've been still so long, and it just starts to shut down. Now we're an hour into the process, and things don't start yet. What I've found is that more relaxation is required, and you might think, that's absolutely ridiculous. My body just fell asleep. How can I possibly be more relaxed? But you have to remember what you're trying to achieve is a level of relaxation that's comparable with sleep. And the last time you were there is when you were unconscious. So from this point, I just continue to lay there. I continue this process. I try to just kind of take take notice of what's going on sort of in my peripheral vision, but my primary focus is on reviewing my body and saying, can I relax this part anymore? Can I relax that part anymore? Can I relax the muscles in my eyes or my jaw or my forehead any further? And I just continue with my repetitive, monotonous thought and wait for something to happen. So usually another half hour or 45 minutes into the process, and keep in mind at this point we're at an hour and a half, then something will start to happen. I'll start to have pre-vibration sensations. So at this point we're still not at the vibrational state. I just start to experience things that tell me it's on its way and it's getting closer. And for me, these pre-vibration sensations are a few different things. It starts out as sort of a cutting in and out of sound. So, and it's more than that. It feels almost like a stopping of time, where everything just freezes momentarily, and sound is included in that. Sound is the most noticeable piece of that. And it's hard to describe how it feels when it feels like time stops, but that's absolutely what it feels like. Almost, if you ever owned a Discman back in the day, and you played CDs on your Discman, and you would tap it and it would skip, and just for a moment it would click off and there would be silence until it found its spot and it would turn back on again. From a sound perspective, it's almost just like that, along with this feeling of time stopping with it. Other people I think have experienced the same thing. Frank Keppel talks about the feeling of a feather stroking his brain, which I don't personally experience, but he also talks about the sound cutting out, so he did experience that aspect of it. Now, shortly after this cutting in and out of sound, this will happen 3 or 4 times, and after it's happened 3 or 4 times, if I can remain relaxed, remain calm, and just continue this process, it'll move into this pulsating static. And the static sounds almost like a TV that's between channels, and it just pulsates. It's like a rhythmic pulsation. It doesn't match my heartbeat. It doesn't match any sort of biological rhythm that I can think of. It's just a steady pulsating, maybe once or twice a second static sound, and it's accompanied by this surge of energy. And at the first, the sound is almost imperceptible. The static, you can almost not even hear it at all. And I wear earplugs specifically for this reason. It tends to be what I think of as an internal sound. And with earplugs in, I can hear this sound much more quickly in the process, much sooner, and I can realize, hey, I'm making progress, so don't give up yet, especially if I've put an hour and a half into it. So the static will start, this pulsating surge of energy will start, and just like the static, the energy surges start very mild as well, almost imperceptible. And if you can just sort of ignore these, just let them happen off in your peripheral vision, then they'll build in intensity, they'll build in frequency, they'll happen more and more frequently until they just turn into one big continuous roar, and that pulsating energy is what becomes the vibrations for me. And that pulsating static is what becomes this massive roar in my head that happens during the vibrational state. So that's the process. This is the lay there and let it happen process. I will be honest, with this process, maybe I'm successful 10% of the time. And that is primarily just due to the fact that I give up before it happens. If I am an hour into this process and I haven't achieved anything yet, I'll just roll over and go to sleep, because I know I've got to get up and go to work the next morning. And I don't want to be exhausted because I spent half the night trying to achieve something that may or may not even happen. So this tends to lead to frustration, and it tends to just lead to general dislike for the practice, and you have to learn to love this practice for it to really become effective. So I don't really recommend this one, although it's possible, and it's how I gained my first experience, so it's worth mentioning. All right, so next is a very similar process, but the time is cut significantly through the process. What I've called in the past, I've talked about it, it's microsleep. Aside from using microsleep, this practice is exactly the same. You lay down, but in this case, you dip in and out of sleep as many times as you can over a short period of time, not moving at all between each dip in and out of sleep. And that includes things like rolling over between dips in and out. It includes scratching, don't move your eyes, don't yawn, anything that you could think of. And it helps if you actually continue sleep breathing as well. Breathe as though you were asleep. Follow that same inhalation, exhalation pattern and motion. Now, if you use this, actually, I wanted to mention a fact here real quick. Micro sleep. I've talked about this a lot in the past. What I found a while back, and I don't know if I shared it or not, is that this actually has a scientific name. I discovered this as I was reading a book on hypnosis. And what this is called it's called hypnotic fractionation. So in the practice of hypnosis, when you dip in and out of trance over and over again, each subsequent dip into trance is deeper than the last. And I know this is not exactly the same thing because we're talking about sleep here and not trance, but it relates because you're putting yourself into this trance-like state. And so every time you wake up and you put your body to sleep and you wake up and you go back to sleep again, your body falls deeper and deeper and deeper asleep and your mind continues to come out. And so I just sort of related that in my own mind, although I know it's slightly different, but it's got a real scientific name besides the one that I've given it. So using microsleep, if I can dip in and out of sleep like 5 or 6 times over the period of half an hour, then my body will be completely asleep. The wave of sleep has come. Pre-exit or pre-vibration sensations have started. They follow the same pattern as mentioned before, and the vibrations usually will kick in by at least 35 minutes into the process. And that is far less time to spend on this. It's far less of an investment. It leads to far less frustration if things just don't work out. And I tend to do this every single night just as practice, to practice the microsleep process, to practice putting my body to sleep. And if it turns into a projection, great. If not, it took me half an hour. It was well worth the practice to continue being able to, to be able to microsleep effectively. It's a much more enjoyable approach to reaching this state. So number 3, and this one leads to a completely different type of experience, and that is, again, I use microsleep to get to the void state, to get to this point where my mind is awake, my body's asleep. So usually 15 to 20 minutes into the process, I'll be there. And then I start using visualizations, and these visualizations only work for me if they include some sort of intense movement. And I've talked about this before using what I call the roller coaster method, where I'm going round and round and round in loops. I've talked about the rope method that Robert Bruce is fond of. What I've discovered actually recently is that it seems to be not so much the motion, but the sense of motion on or the shifting of your point of awareness, or your sense of awareness, your point of consciousness. And this idea came to me as I was rereading Frank Keppel's book for like the 15th time. We all have this point of awareness that's right behind our eyes. That's where we perceive things from, and that's where we kind of perceive ourselves as being. Now, when I do this motion-based visualization, whether it's climbing a rope or doing these roller coaster method, what I've noticed is that the most effective point in that process is when I hit some point that's a little bit backwards and up above my head. And so Frank Keppel, he talks about this, and he talks about how he learned that shifting your point of awareness up and slightly back is an incredibly effective way to generate the vibrations. And so he talked about how he would use the rope technique, and it worked very well. And then eventually he got tired of climbing ropes, so he got creative and he would climb with just one arm or just one leg. And eventually he said, I'm tired of ropes completely. And so he would just generate the feeling of moving upward. And that's all it took. There was nothing magical about the rope. It was the impact that visualization had on his point of consciousness, on his point of awareness, and how it shifted it upwards and back slightly. And that's absolutely the case for me as well. In fact, on the roller coaster method, the only point that's effective for me is after I've gone upside down in the loop in my mind, and I'm on my way back down the opposite side, which is above my head and slightly to the back. And I don't know why that point is effective, but it definitely is. I've been playing with that recently, and playing with the idea of just shifting that without any sort of visualizations, and it seems to work just as well, just as Frank Keppel had said. All right, so when you're doing this and you're shifting your point of awareness, you're using these motion-based techniques. If you can get them to work well, again, they have to be done in the void state, or you just won't get any sort of realistic sensations. What happens for me is that I skip all of the pre-vibration sensations. There's no stopping of sound and time. There's no pulsating static. It is just nothing to roaring vibrations in the matter of a second. And they come in very, very quickly, very, very intensely, and then I'm just fired out of my body at high speed. And the reason I say this, it results in a different experience, is because I'm not in my bedroom when I land. I am shot out, and I have no control over where I go. I've landed in the middle of fields and oceans. I've landed in the middle of mountain ranges. I've landed in the middle of crowds of people. And it's kind of a fun way to explore new places other than your own bedroom. So I'd say that's number 3. All right, so that is the direct method. Those are the only 3 approaches I've ever used to reach the vibrational state using the direct method. So next, if we talk about the indirect method. Now, the indirect method, it's sort of the opposite of the direct method. Instead of projecting without lapses in consciousness, you're attempting to project ideally during the transition out of sleep into wakefulness, or at the very least immediately upon waking up. And this is my preferred approach. 70% of my success rate comes from using the indirect method. So from here, there's a few different scenarios. One is absolutely the holy grail of scenarios. It is absolutely my favorite, which is when I'm able to dip in and out of sleep over several sessions during the morning. So I'll wake up, I'll use the wake back to bed method. I lay back down, it's typically about 3 in the morning, and I will just dip in and out of sleep until about 4. And, by all means, don't just rely on your own internal intent and clock to wake you up. You can use a tool or a crutch. I use a ramp timer to this day to dip myself in and out of sleep over and over again, especially if I'm tired and I feel like I'm not going to have enough control to micro sleep that early in the morning. And what I've found is that quite often I will wake up, and if I can catch that transition out of sleep, I will catch the vibrational state while I'm waking up. And there's nothing required to bring it about. It's like I'm waking up mid vibrations. I roll right out of body, and it feels like the easiest thing in the world. So that's ideal. But to get there, what I have found I have to do is I have to wake up, go to sleep repeatedly over and over and over again. Again, 5 to 6 times at least in an hour. And during that entire time, you can't move, you can't roll over. It just has to be this process where you're basically going in and out of sleep, and that tends to result in spontaneous sleep paralysis. And if I'm lucky, I can catch that transition, catch the vibrational state on the way out of sleep, and just roll out of bed. So what if you're not that lucky? So I still wake up at 3 in the morning, and I still go put myself awake and asleep and awake and asleep using like a ramp timer, or just using micro sleep if I'm feeling up to it. And if nothing happens during that hour, what I do is at 4 o'clock I turn off my ramp timer, or I quit trying to do micro sleep. And then I roll over onto my side, because that's my natural sleeping position, and with all of the intent that I can put into it, I say, now I'm going to go to sleep. I start sleep breathing, breathe the way I do when I sleep. I don't move. I close my eyes. I roll my eyes back into my head, and I focus on shifting my point of awareness upward, above my head, towards the headboard. And I do this by focusing it on a point a little bit on the center of the top of my head and a little bit back. And I start to focus on what it would feel like if somebody was going like this on the top of my head, right behind, I suppose it's the crown of my head. And I can actually start to feel these sensations, and it feels like somebody's actually twirling like a paintbrush on the top of my head. Now, as soon as I feel that, what I do is I try to move that upward. I try to see how far I can move that sensation from the top of my head and continue to feel it. And during this process, if I can continue to relax deeper and deeper and deeper while keeping my mind awake, my body will usually pretty quickly just go into sleep paralysis, and it will fall asleep, because I've just spent an hour going in and out of sleep over and over and over again, which on its own tends to lead to spontaneous sleep paralysis. But when I roll over on my side with a strong intent to just say, okay, I'm going to sleep, at least enough to tell my body I'm going to sleep, while internally I'm saying, no, I'm keeping my mind awake. That, along with this visualization of moving my point of awareness upward, is very effective in starting the process off. And it begins exactly the same way: the stopping of sound and time, the pulsating static, the pulsating surges of energy, and the vibrations, and then I can roll out. So those are the 2 different scenarios that I use when I'm using the indirect method. And there's other ways to go about the indirect method. If you don't want to work with your point of awareness, that's just something I've found recently that works really well for me. There's absolutely other things that you can do. Something I was doing prior to that is I would just lay there and I would think about my most recent dream. And that seems to have a very strong impact as well on your body, because your body says, oh, you were just dreaming that just a minute ago, you must be asleep. And my body would very quickly go into sleep paralysis. So I'd lay there completely still, breathe as though I was asleep, think about my most recent dream, my body falls asleep, and the process kicks off. I have found that for me personally, techniques tend to get stale after a while, and they lose their efficacy. So I I was doing this for a long time and I had a lot of success with it for a few months, and then it just slowly just quit working quite as well. So I moved on to this shifting your point of awareness. This is working really well right now, but eventually this is going to quit working for me too, and I'll probably go back to the prior technique because things tend to work again when I go back to them. I don't know why that is. I haven't figured that out, but they just tend to get stale over time, so I have to switch my practice up occasionally. Now, one more thing in regards to the indirect method. If you read The Phase, Michael Raduga's book, he talks about cycling through techniques. Now, this is it's a great approach to find something that works for you, whether that's phantom wiggling, which I've had a lot of success with, whether that's straining your brain or focusing on internal noises or whatever the case may be. It works really well to cycle through techniques, at least at the beginning, to find a technique that sort of resonates with you. So when I found this focusing on my most recent dream, I just used that exclusively. And when I found this shifting my point of awareness, now I use that exclusively. Before that, I was using phantom wiggling. And what was interesting is I would have my hand under my pillow because I'm laying on my side, and I would just start wiggling my finger like this. And it wasn't my physical finger, it was my non-physical finger. But the closer I got to that awake asleep threshold, the closer I got to that borderland of sleep, the more realistic that motion felt. And it got to the point where I was feeling the inside of my pillow with my non-physical finger, and it felt 100% realistic, and it was very difficult for me to tell whether or not I was moving my physical hand. The only reason I knew that I wasn't is because my finger was inside my pillow, and that just wasn't possible. So as I'm doing this, what I found is that every time I'd move my finger this way, I'd get a little pulse of static. I'd move it back out, and the pulsating static would happen again. And I did it a few more times, and the static followed the movement of my finger. So I stopped, and I thought, well, I'll just focus on the static now. As soon as I stopped moving, that static stopped as well. So I started back up again, and there goes the static. It was psst, psst, psst. So again, I don't know why this works. But what I've found is that there's some correlation between these non-physical movements and the sensations that you feel. So if you've never had any experience with anything like this working, it's a great idea to pick a few techniques, pick things from different categories, whether that's imagined movement or something auditory where you're listening for non-physical sounds, or something visual where you're looking for non-physical lights or patterns or imagery, whatever that is. Cycle through different options and different techniques and different ideas until you find something that really resonates and works well for you. So that's my best advice I've got there. As far as reaching the vibrational state, those are the techniques that I use. That is pretty much it. The only other scenario that I ever run into is coming out of a lucid dream, but that's very, very comparable to the indirect method, where you're coming out of sleep and catching that transition. The benefit of a lucid dream is that I can build that intent ahead of time, and I can say, I'm going to start rolling out of body, I'm going to start rolling out of body, I'm going to start rolling out of body, and then I let myself slowly start waking up, and almost 100% of the time I can catch the vibrations at that state, and I'll just roll right out onto the floor. With a lucid dream, being able to build that intent before you even wake up is incredibly helpful. So that is it. Those are the methods that I use to reach the vibrations. One thing I would really love to learn that I haven't accomplished yet is achieving the vibrational state during meditation. I have talked to people personally who do that, and they, I mention the vibrational state, and they say, oh, that's what that is. I've been experiencing that for years during meditation. And that is incredible to me that you can get to that point while you're meditating. I have been meditating for 3.5 years now and never once experienced anything close to the vibrational state during those sessions. So I hope to get there one day, but everybody's different, as we've established, so it may just not be something that I ever experience. We'll see. So if you've got any other approaches to reaching the vibrational state, if you've got any questions, I know I sort of blasted through this fairly quickly, but we're already at half an hour. So I wanted to go ahead and cut this video off. But if you've got questions, if you've got comments, any other ideas that can help people out, please post in the Facebook group. Please post in the comments below. Anything that you can provide would be amazing. As always, like, comment, subscribe, help me build this community, and I will talk to you guys again soon.